Alrighty, welcome back to another thrilling installment of Wordy-Wednesdays. I'm your intrepid narrator, Fraggeth, and this week we will be reading some more of The Edge of Running Water from the Rim of Morning science fiction double feature by William Sloane. So our boy Dick was interrogated by his old friend and colleague Julian about what he's been doing with what are they? Not electrocardiograms. Come on now, boy. My brain's fried. Let me flip through and see what I can. Basically, brain scans. Brain electrical impulses, because it has some relevance to what Julian is doing. But Julian's like, well, I'm not actually going to show you or tell you what I'm really doing here. I'm not going to show it to you. I'm going to welch on my deal. And Dick's like, okay, but it makes it awfully tough for me to help you. Because it seems like you've completely gone around the bend. Anyway, in order to chill off, to cool off, he and Anne go and hang out on the lawn and I think maybe go for another swim. But then the rain comes in and they have to run back in. And as they're doing so, a terrible noise starts coming out of the building, out of the Talcott House. How was it described? Here we go. It happened as we passed the maple tree under which we had been lying earlier in the afternoon. Between one step and the next, I found myself stopped, as if I had run into a wall, or come to the edge of an unexpected cliff, and halted instinctively. For a second, I did not understand why I had been brought up short, and then I knew. It was the thing Anne and Mrs. Marcy had tried to describe to me. By the time I was fully aware of it, the noise had stopped, but the echo of it was still in my ears. It was a deep and indescribable thing, a single and yet as multiple as the noise of a tempest or the roar of a rock slide. So, a spooky noise has emanated from the house. But then they get into the house, and they are confronted with a scene. They were all three there, Julian, Mrs. Walters, and Mrs. Marcy. Two of them had whirled as they heard our feet on the boards behind them. The two were Julian and Mrs. Walters. And with that, we find out what they've seen. What is this scene before them? And hello, Optical Antenna. Thanks for tuning in. Chapter 12. Mrs. Marcy was lying at the foot of the stairs, on her back, with her arms flung out. Her face was a flat gray white, and her eyes were closed. It was dim in that hall, and we were both winded and trembling with the aftermath of our sprint across the fields, but Anne and I had the same impression when we saw the woman lying there. In her limpness, in the sprawl of her arms, there was something not quite natural, a distortion that was almost imperceptible and which made me think of a doll flung into a corner by a child bored with playing. In the next second, Mrs. Walters was kneeling beside that motionless figure. "She's had a fall." Her voice was decisive, almost unperturbed. "Did you see it happen, Julian?" I was shocked at the way he looked, like a man who has received a sudden knife in the back. His eyes were staring and black, and he wavered as he stood there 3 or 4 steps from the bottom of the stairs, with one hand on the balustrade to steady himself. I don't know," he answered finally in a thin, groping voice. "Of course you do," said the woman, without looking at him. "She must have slipped coming down the stairs, or perhaps she fainted right on the stairs and fell. Didn't you hear it happen?" Julian's eyes were still unfocused on anything. "I don't know," he said. "I don't know." I shook the inaction of surprise from me and started forward. "Wait a minute, Mr. Sayles," the woman was saying, and her voice was so calm and steady that it was soothing. "Let's get her on the sofa." She picked Mrs. Marcy up as if the burden was no more than a child and strode into the living room. As I followed, I noticed that one thin, freckled arm hung down, the palm of the dangling hand turned oddly outward from the limp body. I saw that, but I didn't think about it. As a matter of fact, I did not behave with dispatch or assurance in those first few minutes. It was a shock, of course, to come on that scene at the foot of the stairs, and somehow a surprise, too. The note of disaster in that noise we had heard in the meadow had not prepared me for this ugly yet comprehensible accident. Mrs. Walters' calmness, the certainty with which she acted, kept me from anything except an incredulous contemplation of the whole scene. Probably fate was wise in making me into a college professor. I do not seem cut out to be a man of action. Mrs. Walters put her burden down on the sofa and bent over it. Without turning round, she said, coolly and rapidly, "Anne, there's a bottle of aromatic spirits in my room. Get it at once, please. Bring a glass and a spoon, too. Water in the glass. Mr. Sayles, will you give Julian a hand? This has been a shock to him." Hypnotized by her assurance and uncertain of myself, I went back into the hall. Julian was still standing on the same step, staring down at the boards where Mrs. Marcy had been lying a minute before. He was swaying on his feet, the look of blank surprise and horror still on his face. When I put my hand on his shoulder, I felt his whole body trembling. "Julian," I said, "are you all right?" "I am all right." His voice was so low that I could scarcely hear it. Then he added something to himself, words that were hardly more than the sound of breath. I could not make them out. The next few minutes are a kaleidoscope in my memory. Some way or other I got Julian down the steps and into the living room. I made him sit down in a chair. The only part of that which sticks in my mind is wholly irrelevant, the patch of wetness on his shirt where I made him lean against me. Then Anne's feet came hurrying down the stairs, and the next thing I noticed was the white look of strain and alarm on her face as she brought the things Mrs. Walters had requisitioned. The big woman was the only one of us who seemed to be in perfect command of herself. She put a spoonful of the aromatic spirits between Mrs. Marcy's gray lips as calmly as if she were oiling a sewing machine. Anne and I stood behind her helplessly, looking down at the unmoving body huddled on the sofa. We could not see much of it over the immense black curve of Mrs. Walters' shoulders and back. Suddenly she straightened and confronted us. "Put some clothes on, you ninnies," she said harshly. "Anne, as soon as you're dressed, get the car out of the barn and go to town. Get a doctor. Don't waste time stopping at the Marcy house either. Their phone will be out. It always is after a thunderstorm. And hurry." She was right, of course, and we retreated to the kitchen and found our clothes still bundled. They were not really very damp, at least mine weren't. Anne disappeared upstairs. I changed right there in the kitchen, and I changed fast. These events, which I am describing here in all the detail that I was subsequently forced to remember, were actually happening to us with great speed. It was natural, I think, that we did not see what was going on. By the time I had pulled on the most essential items of clothing, Anne was running downstairs. She scarcely paused on her way through the kitchen.
"I'll get the car out and warm it up a minute," she said. "You can finish tying your shoelaces while I'm doing that."
The kitchen door slammed behind her. As I lifted my head from the second shoe... yes. As I lifted my head from the second shoe, I saw that Mrs. Walters was standing in the door to the hall, looking at me. She was, indeed, leaning calmly against the doorframe, and I noticed with reluctant admiration that there was no confusion or uncertainty on her face. It was as placid as if this emergency were a matter of routine. "Mr. Sayles," she said in a level voice, "I'm assuming that you will go with Anne. I think an older head will be a good idea." "Of course I'll go," I said, "unless you need me here or something." "No, there's nothing more to do here. She's come to now, the aromatic spirits, I suppose, and she's not in any pain yet. But if she's seriously hurt, naturally she will be as soon as the shock wears off. You and Anne will have to hurry. Look out for the road, though. It will be like grease after this rain." "Certainly," I said, irked by the didactic tone of her speech. She must have caught the irritation in my voice. "Excuse me if I sound bossy, but I'm in a rush. I don't want to leave her alone too long, even if she does seem to be all right, really. Anyhow, Mr. Sayles, I meant that about not stopping at Seth Marcy's house, partly for the reason I gave you, and partly because I don't want that fool of a man over here till we're sure his wife's all right. He'll make a scene and a whole mountain out of a molehill, and not do her any good." Much as I did not like that woman, I had to admire the sure, executive way she was handling the whole miserable business. I told her that I was not cross, and to get on back to Mrs. Marcy, and promised that we'd return with a doctor in an hour or less, and that we wouldn't stop at Marcy's, though I had some mental reservations about that last. Then a horn honked outside the door, and I went out into the yard. The rain was still falling, but not in gusts and torrents. It looked as though it might stop in half an hour or so, but it was still coming down fast enough to make me sprint for the battered Ford sedan in which Anne was sitting. Main mud and dust were plastered all over it, but the motor sounded smooth under the hood. Even before my door was closed, Anne was wrenching the car around and stepping it up from gear to gear. As we straightened out into the road, the machine slewed sickeningly, and I perceived that this was going to be quite a ride. The storm had soaked the loose top dirt of the track and turned it into a slimy lubricant between our wheels and the underlying hardpan. We skidded at every rut. "How about chains?" Anne didn't take her eyes off the road, but she grinned. "Haven't any, Dick. Don't worry." We struck a pothole. When the car was back on an even keel, she said, "Do you think we ought to stop off at Marcy's anyhow? It'll be a mile, and 10 minutes out of our way if the phone isn't working." "No," I answered. "I guess Mrs. Walters is right about that. We won't save much time, even if the phone is working, and it seems to me like a poor gamble."
"Probably."
She avoided a crater full of brown water and wrestled the car back across the slimy surface of the road.
"Seth Marcy's nobody's pet, anyhow. I've only seen him a couple of times. But he's the kind of man who doesn't open his mouth unless he has something unpleasant to say. I feel sorry for Elora."
"We'll forget him, then, till we get a doctor. After that, we can go to his house and tell him." We went on, not exactly racing, but making incredible speed for the condition of the road. Anne handled the car with a magnificent blend of daring and judgment. I thought we weren't going to make up the bridge at the turn by the creek, but we got across it by a hair, and when we hit the road along the far bank of the bay, the going was better. Even with the chances Anne took, I did not feel nervous about her driving.
There was competence in the way her hands were resting on the wheel, in the way she sat behind it, alert but not tense. It was, indeed, strangely pleasant, that ride. We were in a private world of our own, with rain on our roof and streaking down the windows, shutting us in together. I liked it. For a mile or so I forgot our errand, forgot the bleak house behind us, and thought of nothing except that this fortuitous intimacy was different from anything that had ever happened to me before. After 20 minutes, or perhaps a little longer, the unlovely center of Barsham Harbor was flashing past our windows. I have often wished since that I had looked at my watch more frequently that day, but it was still in the side pocket of my coat, where I had put it when we went swimming, and I remembered it only as we pulled into town. It was 10 minutes after 4 then, and the light was already beginning to fade, thanks to the clouds and the rain. Our luck seemed to be out from the moment we hit the town. There were, it appeared, 3 doctors in Barsham Harbor. Dr. Peters was out on a call. Dr. Solomon, whom we tried next, had gone to Bath and was not expected back for several hours. The third and last was Dr. Rambouillet. His house was beyond the Catholic Church on the other side of the railroad tracks, and his small shingle looked auspiciously new. But he was at home.
Dr. Peters is the Marcy family doctor. Dr. Peters is the Marcy family doctor, he said to us when we told him our errand. I think you'd better get him. The people here... He shrugged with the Latinity of the French Canadian. Oh, I can do a good Quebecois if I have to. He's out on call, I said. This is an emergency. With no more demur, he picked up his bag and got into the car. All right, but don't say I didn't warn you.
The teeth under his narrow black mustache were startling when he smiled. He couldn't have been over 28.
I'll do what I can, he declared, and then turned the case over to Dr. Peters. You see,
and he smiled again disarmingly,
the people of Barsham Harbor either do want a French-Canadian doctor or they don't. We keep to our own sides of the fence, or perhaps I ought to say of the tracks. You understand?
Yes, I said, and sympathize. What was your school, Doctor?
McGill, and the ink is quite dry on the diploma.
I laughed. Anne was too busy driving to pay much attention to what we were saying. The day was drawing in, and he switched on... The day was drawing in, and she switched on the lights when we turned at the bridge. I watched the road slither and dance under our wheels. The thought that went through my head that it was impossible I had got off the State of Maine Express only that morning. Did I read that sentence correctly? I'm going to try that paragraph from the top. I think I flubbed some things. If I didn't, oh well. If I did, then I'm correcting it now. I laughed. Anne was too busy driving to pay much attention to what we were saying. The day was drawing in, and she switched on the lights when we turned right at the bridge. I watched the road slither and dance under our wheels. The thought went through my head that it was impossible I had got off the State of Maine Express only that morning. The day had been going on for half a lifetime already. I was tired and sleepy. The thing to do would be to get to bed as soon after supper as was decently possible. The sight of the house ahead of us, black and solid in the twilight, reminded me that there was plenty still to be done before any of us could think of supper or sleep. Anne slid the car to a stop right at the kitchen steps, and we piled out and through the door in a hurry. The situation on the other side of the threshold made me, for one, feel stupidly foolish. Stupefiedly foolish. Chapter 13. Why I should have been so taken aback by the sight of Mrs. Walters setting the table, I don't quite know, except that we had come racing home to the house to cope with an emergency, and Mrs. Walters at a household task was nothing like what I had expected. Perhaps it was her calmness that stopped me in my tracks, the very domesticity of her appearance in a big blue-figured dress and apron, leisurely laying out knives and forks. When she turned to face us, there was a look of embarrassment on her face. "Oh, dear," she said in the warmest tones I had yet heard from her. "What a pity you've had all the hurry and trouble for nothing." "For nothing?" Anne's voice was incredulous. "I'm afraid so. Mrs. Marcy is perfectly all right again. I suppose I took it too seriously when I saw her lying there at the foot of the stairs. She frightened me, and I jumped to the conclusion that she was badly hurt. But she got up not 5 minutes after you'd started. I'd made her wait round a while. But she was so obviously recovered that I finally sent her home. She insisted she was entirely over it, but I felt it would be better if she did not work any more today. She kept trying to help me, and finally I sent her home, as I said. You were gone a long time." Dr. Rambouillet put his black satchel down on the floor and sighed, but it seemed to me that there was an expression of relief on his face.
Are you sure she was all right?" he inquired. "No sign of sleepiness? No thickness of the tongue? No difficulty in speaking?"
"Not that I could see." Mrs. Walters had returned to her table setting, and I noticed that the hand with which she put... And I noticed that the hand with which she put out the water glasses was entirely steady. That woman was, I think, a great actress, the greatest I have ever seen. Nothing in the way she looked, spoke, or acted was other than natural, ordinary, or even casual. After a silence that was long enough to show how calm she was, she turned to us and went on. "I wasn't sure I should let her start home so soon, frankly. I loaned her my umbrella, and she went part way down the road with her to make sure she was all right. I'm positive of it. She didn't seem to have even a sprain. Her only complaint was that she had a headache."
"Well," the doctor said uncertainly, "from what you say, there should be no danger of a concussion, and evidently there were no broken bones."
Mrs. Walters bridled at the reluctance in his voice. "I would not have let her take a step out of this house if I hadn't been sure she was all right. Of course, you can stop by at Marcy's and see her if you want, Dr.
"Rambouillet,"
said that young man politely. "Oh, are you the Marcy's usual doctor?"
"No," he answered shortly. "Dr. Peters was out on a call."
The minute he said that, she had him right where she wanted him. But the way she managed it was masterful, and, even now, in remembering it, I am moved to a grudging admiration of the way she carried it all off. "I see," she remarked so casually that I barely caught the note of triumph in her voice. "Well, then, I suppose they'll have called him by this time, if there's any need." Rambouillet nodded.
"Undoubtedly."
He turned to Anne and me.
"I'm sorry, but there's apparently nothing here for me to do, and since I didn't come out in my own car, I'm afraid I'll have to trouble you to run me back into town."
We said we would, and Anne went upstairs to get a coat. I offered the doctor a drink, which he declined, and forced him to accept $3, which he felt he hadn't earned. A call was a call, I pointed out, and he was entitled to a fee even if there had been no patient. He put the money in his pocket finally, with a wry smile.
"A young doctor in this town," he remarked, "has no right to refuse anything that comes his way."
We chatted quietly in that warm, agreeable kitchen, hardly aware of Mrs. Walters as she went about the room. And yet it crossed my mind once or twice that she looked more attractive than she had in the morning. The lamplight was kind to her face, and there was a touch of femininity about her dress that was welcome. I wondered idly why she had changed. Probably she'd got wet walking back in the rain after giving Mrs. Marcy her umbrella. Later, I came to have a different opinion about that, but at the time I hardly thought about it at all. What dress Mrs. Walters wore was a matter of no interest or importance to me, or so I would have considered if I had thought about it at all, which I didn't. Anne came back in 5 minutes, and the three of us went out to the car. The rain had slacked to a drizzle, and night was at hand. A heavy gray twilight shut the house in upon itself, and the heat of the day had gone. The air was cold and raw. Mrs. Walters stood in the door and watched us as we drove off, the lamplight came out from behind her and threw a blotched, half-formed shadow of her big body across the yard. As we drove in silence back toward Barsham Harbor, I thought how puppet-like we had all been, moving around at the ends of our strings while Mrs. Walters pulled them. Able and competent she certainly was, but it was impossible to like her. Since Mrs. Marcy was all right, the episode turned out to be a trivial one, and yet it seemed to me that Mrs. Walters had acted throughout it with a firmness and decision that were somehow unnecessary. The truth was that I was full of that petty resentment which a man feels when he thinks that a woman has acted with more authority and energy in an emergency than he himself has done. On the trip home, I drove the car, and Anne sat beside me. It should be noted, again, that this is written in, I think, the 30s, 37? Let me double check. 39. So, the prevailing views on women of the time come through. And race, but we don't get much of that in either of these. H.P. Lovecraft, he ain't. Oh, boy. Anne came back. Oh, no, we did that. Did we do that one, too? Yes, we did. The truth was that I was full of that petty resentment which a man feels when he thinks a woman has acted with more authority and energy in an emergency than he himself has done. On the trip home, I drove the car, and Anne sat beside me. In the glow of the dashlight, her face was tired and thoughtful. I thought how very young and sweet and defenseless she looked, and wanted to put my arm around her. But that would have been ridiculous. After all, a practically middle-aged college professor has no business making passes at girls. Besides, I was afraid of doing anything to mar the feeling between us. After a while, she stirred in her seat and looked at me. "I'm glad Mrs. Marcy is all right," she said slowly. "I like that little person, Dick. She's had so much hard luck in her life." "I know." "If that woman let her walk her home and she wasn't perfectly all right, I'm going to make trouble about it." "She was all right. I doubt if Mrs. Walters makes many mistakes in the course of a year." That brought a smile. "I suppose you're right. It's nice not having to confront her alone, Dick. I'm glad you're here." "It sounds contrary to common sense," I said, "but I'm glad I am too." We said no more on the ride. As the Marcy house dropped past us on the left, I had a momentary impulse to turn in. But I didn't yield to it. There seemed no real necessity. When the car finally slithered to a stop in the yard, Mrs. Walters opened the kitchen door and called to us, "Hurry up, you two! Supper in 5 minutes!" I put the car in the barn and went back to the house. For the first time that day, I went to my room to get ready for the meal. It was a square, small cubicle with 2 windows looking northward and also down onto the yard and the roof of the L. There was nothing in it but a cot, a battered washstand, and 1 chair. The single candle they had given me burned small and cold on the stand. Its light wavered and leaped in the raw air so that the place was full of sudden, shapeless shadows. As I changed my shirt and combed my hair, I felt an uneasiness which I recognized coming back into my consciousness. It was a kind of mental discomfort rather than anything stronger, and it had been in my mind more than once in the course of this day. By a sort of casual introspection, I tried to find out what, specifically, it was that bothered me. The house, for one thing, I decided. If you are not used to cold, dark rooms with a single candle for light, the experience is a strange one, belonging to our ancestors' ordinary routine of life, perhaps, but not to that of a modern-day city dweller. And Mrs. Walters. I did not like her, or the dark that had settled over the house. Julian ought not to have such a woman around, and why hadn't he put electric lights into the rooms since he had wired in the power? The lamp in the kitchen and the candle in this room were separate islands of light, and there were too many shadows between them. I thought of the hall outside my door, and it seemed to me that there might be someone in it, but when I looked out it was empty and silent. I thought of the shadowy living room, of the river water noiselessly running and running, almost under the sills of its windows. 100 years and more this house had stood here, alone on the point. 100 years of sun and storm, of winters and summers, of dark and light. It was old, but it was not its age that gave me the tight feeling I had in the pit of my stomach. In the end, I had to give up the effort to discover what I thought was wrong. There were too many possibilities and nothing probable. The accident, when I thought about it, did not seem to explain the feeling wholly, though I admitted to myself that when I had seen Mrs. Marcy lying in that unnatural way at the foot of the stairs, I had thought for one instant, "Now it's happened." But that was obviously meaningless. As it turned out, nothing had happened. And equally, if the accident had been important in some way, I could not see why or to whom, except Mrs. Marcy, it was important. What the "it" was that had happened I did not understand, though I assigned it to the feeling of imminence which had come over me earlier in the afternoon. That, in turn, was unquestionably caused by the approach of the thunderstorm. Still, the lightning and thunder, and most of the rain, had long ago swept away to the northeast, and it seemed to me that the air was as charged with suspense as ever. Suspense, I reminded myself, is a purely subjective matter. There was no way of telling whether the way I felt had any external foundation or not. Difficult to believe though it may seem, I paid little attention to the notion that Julian and his invention might account for my disquietude. I felt pity and sorrow for him, but they were ordinary, normal emotions. As for the thing he had made, it was only too apparent that it was harmless, like those perpetual motion machines that unbalanced inventors are forever producing. No machine could approach the complex sensitivity of the human mind itself, and if our brains had not, after centuries, given us any sure proof that the individuality survives the fact of death, then it was certain that Julian's machine wouldn't either. Perhaps, if I had been superstitious, I would have been inclined to give more weight to that project of his. The house would have been haunted by its presence, and the potential presence of the myriads of voices that were supposed to speak through it. But they weren't there. Of that I felt sure, just as it was self-evident that a physical machine could not be expected to produce a non-physical result. The very impossibility of the machine's working brought home to me the difficulty of doing anything to help Julian. His frailty told me how little time there was left in which to save him, if he could be saved, and the driving eagerness I had heard in his voice when he talked showed how strong was the obsession I should have to break through. The impression which he gave of being cut off from all reality distressed me when I thought about it. I had promised Anne not to fail, and promised myself, too. I owed something to Julian, and, as I thought about him, I was ashamed of myself for bothering with the vague fancies and premonitions that had been running through my head. Why had I puzzled so much over them, and so little over how I was to save my friend? As I stood in that dim, cold room, trying to straighten my tie in the shadowy disk of my shaving mirror, no answer came back to that question. Only a vague feeling and intuition that the question itself was not the crux of the situation. It is hard to convey intangible suggestions in the rigid forms and patterns of words, but what I felt then was a kind of fear. The trouble was that it was a fear without an object. All I was sure of was that I was not afraid of Julian, and not even for him, except in a general sort of way. Neither was it Mrs. Walters. Thinking about her intensified the sensation slightly, but she was not the source of it, and the fact that it apparently had no focal point began to annoy me. I was like a man walking down an unfamiliar street in a strange city, late at night, with a vague substratum of uneasiness in his mind. He does not say to himself, "Maybe I am going to get held up and beaten in this place." He simply feels uneasy. But if he sees the shadow of a man shouldered back in a doorway, his fear rushes together like wind to the heart of a cyclone. It fastens itself on that figure and embodies itself with its image. My fear seemed to have no such focal point. It colored the rest of my thoughts, but it had no shape of its own. That, I was forced to tell myself finally, was evasion. In the back of my mind I did know of what I was afraid, but it was senseless to allow it to color my consciousness so poisonously. It was nothing more specific than the noise that we had heard, Anne and I, as we ran toward the house in the rain. But why was I afraid of that sound, or rather, of hearing it again? I finished my dressing quickly, not liking to think about it. From the moment I had remembered that noise, I found myself listening for it again. Mrs. Walters was still alone in the kitchen when I got downstairs. In spite of all my thinking, not more than 10 minutes had passed since I had gone upstairs. The table, I saw, was completely set, and there was a comfortable smell of food in the air. I said, "Hello," and she answered with a smile that would have been all right if we had been the best of friends. "Supper's almost ready," she observed. I brushed that aside. "Mrs. Walters, there's something I want to talk to you about." She smiled again, more thinly. "Very well, Professor Sales. Only let's be quiet. I've given Julian a sleeping tablet after the shock of this afternoon. It ought to make him sleep clear through tonight, but I don't want to take a chance on waking him. He needs all the rest he can get." "Certainly." I kept my voice low. "This is it. When Anne and I were running back to the house just before we found you and Julian and Mrs. Marcy, we heard a noise." "Did you? Did you? Did you? Did you?" Her voice was without intonation. "Yes." She was looking at me steadily. I returned her stare and went on. "It was an odd sort of noise. We thought it came from this house." She dropped her glance. "Perhaps it did. You haven't told me what it was like." Her tone was wholly indifferent, and while she spoke she carried a plate of soup from the stove and set it at one of the places. "A sort of roaring, pulsing, crashing sound," I said, and the words sounded silly in my own ears. She did not permit herself a smile. "Goodness, it sounds complicated. No, I did not happen to hear it, but of course I know what it was. So do you." Maybe I'm obtuse, but I don't think I do. She went back for another plate. "Nonsense, Mr. Sales. Thunder, of course. Sometimes here in the valley the claps echo back and forth. I've heard something like what you mention once or twice myself." The thing sounded as if it came from this house. She shrugged. "From somewhere over the roof, perhaps. I may have heard it and forgotten it because of everything that happened right afterward. I don't know. What difference does it make?" "It wasn't thunder," I said quietly. "Mrs. Marcy told me she'd heard it once or twice before, and she must know the sound of thunder in her own country, and Anne described it to me before it happened." That seemed to have an effect upon her. She put the second plate down with a clatter and looked at me coldly. "You seem to have lost no time around here, Mr. Sales, talking to Mrs. Marcy and Miss Connor as if you were some kind of private detective. What's on your mind?" "Julian's my friend, Mrs. Walters. I find him in a strange sort of menage and obviously a sick man." She gave me a look of contempt. "You're worried about Julian, so you talked to Mrs. Marcy about him." "No, I didn't talk to her about him. She told me about the noise amongst a lot of other things, all volunteered on her part." I despised myself for not bothering to justify my actions to this woman. Oh, excuse me. I despised myself for bothering to justify my actions to this woman. For a time she paid no further attention to what I had said. Then she stopped doing things around the stove and turned to confront me. "I told you what the noise was, Mr. Sales. If you don't believe me, there's no sense our wasting time about it. You can talk it over some more with Miss Connor and Mrs. Marcy if you're still determined to make a mystery out of a simple, natural thing. The three of you seem to have found something in common. Thunder." The scorn with which she delivered this retort did not affect me, but clearly there was no point in going on with the subject. I sat down in a chair and kept my mouth shut. She looked at me once or twice as if she hoped I'd give her another opening, and then went on with her work. At the end of an uncomfortable silence, she remarked, "I shouldn't wonder if it was that very clap of thunder that frightened Mrs. Marcy. Something must have made her slip on those stairs." I agreed to that hypothesis indifferently, and went on watching the purple light outside the east window fade to blackness across the inky water of the river. The rain had stopped, but the night was sullen and lowering. Mrs. Walters did not seem anxious for another long silence between us. "You know," she said, "I should have asked if you knew first aid, Professor. It never occurred to me. You might have been the very man we needed." She smiled at me, and I still did not like it. "I'm rather accustomed to taking care of sick people, so I just jumped right in. I'm afraid I was rather bossy." "No," I answered, wondering idly what she was getting at. "I'm no expert on what to do till the doctor comes." I was glad you took charge." I turned to look at her. "You must have done a good job. I thought the woman was badly hurt." But that was not what I had really thought. The moment I had caught sight of that fragile, tumbled body at the foot of the stairs, I had thought I was looking at death. The big woman was watching me carefully. There was an alertness that amounted to tension under the makeup on her broad face. "She gave me a turn, too. She looked almost as if she was dead, didn't she?" I nodded. "I was never so relieved in my life as when the aromatic spirits brought her round. It's wonderful what that stuff will do." She gave a little laugh. "But up to then I was really frightened about her." "You picked her up and carried her to that sofa as if you were used to that sort of thing all your life," I said, trying to make my tone sound admiring. It was a stupid little speech, as awkward as most efforts to give the devil his due, but I was surprised at its effect upon her. She bit her lip and turned away. After a while, with her back still turned toward me, she said, "Oh, that was nothing." And then, after a pause, "She wasn't heavy." Chapter 14. Anne came into the kitchen a few minutes later. She had on a dull green dress that brought out the lights in her hair and the warmth of her skin, and, for a second, as I looked at her, some of the depression went out of my mind, and I forgot how tired I was beginning to feel. Supper was a silent meal because none of us seemed to be able to conjure up a topic of conversation that wouldn't leave one member of the trio out of it. After we'd eaten as much as we wanted, which in my case was no great amount, we washed dishes together by a sort of common consent. Personally, I don't like cleaning up after a meal. I did too much of it when I was a boy, but anything was better than leaving the warmth and company of the kitchen to adventure into the silence of the rest of the house. Anne, I think, felt the same way. After we had finished, Mrs. Walters laid a tray for Julian, "in case he wakes up, though I hope he won't," as she put it. And then there was nothing more to do in the kitchen. A trivial thing happened as we started to leave the place.
Well, we can sit in the living room for a few minutes, Anne had just said, with no cheer in her tone,
and picked up the lamp on the table when Mrs. Walters went over to her with sudden swiftness and took the thing out of her hand. "You can't have that," she declared sharply. "I don't want to have to stumble around here in the dark if Julian should happen to need anything." And she put the lamp firmly back on the table. Anne looked startled and indignant for a moment and then turned away.
"I'm sorry. I didn't know you wanted it there."
She looked at Mrs. Walters speculatively.
"You take wonderful care of Uncle Julian," she observed.
"I try to," Mrs. Walters replied in a level voice. We groped our way through the black hall and into the living room. Anne lit the lamp in there, but the pool of yellow light it spilled brightened only a fraction of the place. The shadows in the corners were thick and smooth as velvet. I'm not enunciating. Anne lit the lamp in there, but the pool of yellow light it spilled brightened only a fraction of the place. The shadows in the corners were thick and smooth as velvet. I put a match to my pipe, and Anne smoked a cigarette. We sat together on the sofa, not too close together, and watched Mrs. Walters in the chair by the lamp. She had a basket of mending. "What holes Julian does make in his socks," she observed at last. "He's got to get some new ones. Remind me, Anne, the next time we go into town."
Anne grunted. "You don't need to do all that," she said in a voice that was perceptibly too considerate. "Mrs. Marcy does the darning."
"I know," Mrs. Walters answered shortly, but I noticed that she went on with what she was doing. For a while, Anne and I talked in low tones about the past, about the university, and things we had done together when she was a kid.
"The girls used to tease me about you," she said once, "but they were only jealous."
I grinned at that, but it was not an altogether happy feeling. After a while, our small talk ran down, and the silence took complete possession of the room. Fatigue was heavy in my body, but I was scarcely sleepy. Instead, it seemed to me that I was noticing things with more than normal distinctness. It was preternaturally quiet. I began to wish that the river outside would make more noise instead of slipping to the sea without a sound. My ears felt empty, and, literally, I could hear the sound of my own heart and of Anne's breathing beside me. All the while I was listening, waiting to hear something, and it did not come. After a time I transferred my attention to Mrs. Walters and wondered what was going on behind those eyes of hers. Nothing, to judge from the placidity of her expression, and yet I was sure that she was alert and aware of Anne and myself, perhaps even of what we were thinking. Was she listening, too? Was she listening, too? There we go. Then I yawned, and that seemed to break the shell of quiet in which we had been enclosed.
"You must be dead for sleep," Anne exclaimed suddenly in a contrite voice. "It's practically bedtime anyhow. Let's all go up."
My legs were heavy when I hoisted myself back on them. "To tell the truth, it has been a long day. And your fresh country air has a numbing effect on a pair of city-poisoned lungs like mine." Mrs. Walters nodded. "It has been a long day," she agreed. "Not the happiest possible one for your visit, Professor Sales, but there's always tomorrow." "Absolutely," I agreed. "Well, if you'll excuse me." She did not rise from her chair. "Certainly. Anne, you go along up too. I'll follow you in a minute. I see there's still one more sock to finish, but don't wait for me. I'll be all right alone." A flash of irritation went through me then, as it did so often after the things she said, because there was something obscurely contradictory between her words and the tone in which she uttered them. The way she spoke managed to imply that she wished one or both of us would stay there with her till she was ready to go. I could not see a reason in the world for obliging her. Companionship, at least of the negative sort that Anne and I had provided, could not be what she wanted from us. Neither could it be worry. Confused and unpleasant as the events of that day had been, they were over now, or so I thought. Anne went over to the mantel and lighted a candle. "Time to retire," she said, and made a child's face. As I followed her, I turned once and looked back into the living room. Mrs. Walters was still sitting there quietly, drawing the thread steadily back and forth. The needle gleamed in the lamplight, but her face was turned half away and shadowed. "Good night," I said softly, so as not to wake Julian. "Pleasant dreams," she returned negligently, without lifting her head. My room was colder and darker than before. Anne came into it for a moment and lit the candle on my washstand. "All the discomforts of a fine old colonial home," she said, smiling, and then her face was suddenly grave. "Oh, Dick, I can't tell you." "What, Anne?" "How glad I am you're here. For Uncle Julian's sake and mine. I haven't known what to do." Her voice sounded near tears. I patted her shoulder. "It's going to be all right." "If you say so," she replied, but there was doubt in her voice. "My room's next to yours, by the way, and hers is right across the hall. If you need anything, pound on the wall and I'll get it for you." "Thanks. I won't. Unless it's waking up in the morning. You can pound on the wall when it's time to get up." Then we said good night, and I thought of all the other times we had done that in the old days. It wasn't the same at all, of course, and yet I was reminded of the past in spite of myself. This time it was she who shut the door on me. I was left in the bleakness of my room, shivering. I undressed in silence, without bothering to unpack anything except my pajamas, and got into the cot before the candle wick had stopped glowing. When I surrendered my weight to the bed, I expected that sleep would wash over me in a minute or two, if not immediately. For some reason, it didn't. Even my eyes remained open for a long time, though there was nothing to see except the faintly lighter oblongs of the windows, unbroken by a single star. I deliberately made every muscle in my body relax, but still sleep didn't come, though in those days I never had any trouble about losing myself in unconsciousness the moment I went to bed. But this time my senses were still on the alert even after my body was utterly limp, and, when I finally closed my eyes, oblivion was not complete. Going to sleep is a mysterious process anyhow. The senses don't blur and fade simultaneously and merge into nothingness. The first one to go, of course, is sight, the minute the eyelids are lowered, and then I suppose the next to vanish are taste and smell, though it was a long time before I stopped being aware of the reek of the candle smoke in the air. For an even longer time I was conscious of the rough feeling of the blanket under my chin, and as for hearing, I don't believe I ever did wholly stop listening. There was nothing to hear, nothing important. For a time there were the sounds Anne made in the next room, but they were soon over. And then the occasional crack and creak of an old house settling itself for the night. Outside the windows was the faintest possible rustle of air, and every once in a while the minute plop of a drip from the eaves. These were trivial sounds, and yet I kept hearing them in spite of myself. My mind stubbornly refused to relinquish its last sentry, and I went on listening. Perhaps it was for the sound of Mrs. Walters coming upstairs, which I did hear after a while. She made very little disturbance about it, but I heard her come up the stairs, and it sounded as if she hesitated once or twice on the way up. Then she came down the hall. I could follow that cautious progress of hers there, too, and when she stopped for a long time outside my door, I was not surprised. She was wondering, I knew, if I was asleep. I gave her no clue, though I had an irresistible impulse to utter one loud mock snore to startle her. Even after the door of her room had closed behind her, I could not abandon myself wholly. I was still listening, and I faced the fact that what I expected, or dreaded, to hear was a recurrence of that sound of the afternoon. Whenever I thought squarely about it, the echo of that damnable noise went booming in my inner ear, and, as I lay there, I could feel the prickle of sweat breaking out on the palms of my hands. What could have made such a noise? The conviction was borne in upon me that Julian had progressed very far indeed with that thing of his. It, and it only, could account for the sound. Anne had even recognized it. We should have talked more about it, especially on the second ride back from town, when we were alone and safe from being overheard. But I knew why we had not. There was nothing we could have said about that noise, because there was nothing familiar in it. And there was the possibility that Julian might be right, and that the reason the sound we had heard was so strange and terrifying was because it came— I put the thought out of my mind. Lying in the dark with nothing by which to measure time except the beating of my heart, minutes or hours may have passed before I fell asleep. I have no precise idea how long I lay there listening, or even if I was ever wholly asleep. Probably I was, because the next thing that I knew was that something was happening outside the house. The thing that woke me was surprising. My room, as I have said, looked down on the court between the shoulder of the house and the narrower strip of the L back to the barn. Its windows faced almost north, and hence along the road that led up the point and ultimately to Barsham Harbor. The corner of the barn was between me and most of the road, which was perhaps why the sound of feet on it had not waked me sooner. Anyhow, there was the squelch and thud of feet outside. Someone was approaching the house, and the tempo of the steps was hurried. Whoever it was had a long stride and was hurrying, though not running. The moment I opened my eyes, I could see a faint line of yellow light along the underside of the top window casement on the left, a gleam that alternately dimmed and increased, but which was growing progressively brighter. Although I had never in my life seen that sort of thing before, I knew at once what it was— the light from a lantern carried by a walking man. I got out of bed with anxiety of a nameless sort plucking at my thoughts, and went to the window. I was right. It was a lantern, swinging along the road, but I could see little of whoever was carrying it. Even before the sound of knuckles on the back door, I was into my trousers and shoes and was pulling on my old varsity sweater over my head. Even before the sound of knuckles on the back door, I was into my trousers and shoes and was pulling on my old varsity sweater over my head. Quick as I was, Anne was ahead of me. I bumped into her in the hall outside.
"Dick," she said in a whisper, "what is it? Who's there?"
"Dunno. A man. That's all I could tell." The knuckles were more urgent against the door, and we stumbled down the stairs. Hot paraffin spilled on my hand from Hot paraffin spilled on my hand from the candle I was carrying. Anne was right on my heels as I blundered through the hall and into the kitchen. The knocking sounded much louder in there, of course, and there was an urgency in it that suggested anxiety. There was an urgency in it that suggested anxiety. And then, in that second, as we were coming through the kitchen doorway, the last vestige of comfort or security was stripped from us by a single word. It was spoken from the other side of the door, in a low voice, by the man outside.
"Elora!"
he said, and his tone was half angry, half anxious. Mrs. Marcy's name, of course. I heard Anne give a gasp as she heard it. We both knew, then, who was on the other side of that door, and the knowledge was appalling. It could only be her husband, and that meant— The lamp in the kitchen was still burning, and everything was completely ordinary. I blew out my candle and put it on the table as I went across the room. The bolt stuck in the door, and I had to tug to get it open. All the while, his knuckles were rapping against the panels. "Just a second," I said urgently, and then the bar slid back and I turned the door handle. He was standing on the top step, a tall, slightly stooped farmer with a dark face and a sullen mouth. In the air that blew past him into the room, there was the it's something that smells vaguely of ammonia, but ammoniacal. Ammoniacal. Ammoniacal? Ammoniacal? Ammoniacal. Okay. It caught me by surprise. It really threw my brain for a loop. I had kind of a large breakfast, and I'm, digging through a food coma, so I apologize. I'm pretty relaxed right now. I could take a nap. Right. He was standing on the top step, a tall, slightly stooped farmer with a dark face and sullen mouth. In the air that blew past him into the room, there was the ammoniacal pungency of the cow stable. He stared at me with momentary surprise and then pushed past me into the room. "Where's Alora?" he said harshly. Anne was looking at him with recognition and a white face. "Why, Mr. Marcy," she told him in a thin voice. "Did she come back here for something? She went home hours ago." "Ain't been home yet," he replied, and stared round the room with anger and bewilderment. "Not since morning." He pointed to the lamp. "Her light's still going, too." "Her light?" I asked in confusion. "Yeah, you can see that from our house. When it goes out, I know she's started back. But it's past 10 now. I come over to see what was keeping her." "Listen," I told him, "your wife went home early. She had a minor accident, nothing serious. But Mrs. Walters decided she oughtn't to work any more and sent her home in the afternoon. She even walked part way with her. She must be home." "She ain't." We stood there for a minute staring at him. I know that alarm was going through my mind, siren loud and sudden. Something was terribly wrong. "Sit down a minute," I said. "We'll tell you the whole thing." He took a chair grudgingly. There was a truculence about him that made you dislike the man on sight, and yet he was Mrs. Marcy's husband, and entitled to know what had happened. I gave it to him in as few words as I could. He listened without interruption, though the rigidity of his big body in the chair suggested that he neither believed what I said nor cared much about it, one way or the other. He was not going to be easy to deal with. When I mentioned Dr. Rambouillet's name, he snorted, but that was the only sound he made until I finished. "So," I concluded, "if she hasn't reached your house, we'd better go look along the road." Under the heavy impact of his silence, I began to feel resentful, and, when he made no move to get up, I added sharply, "If she's had a concussion, she may be lying unconscious. We've got to find her at once." "She ain't on the road," he said heavily. "I come that way." "Perhaps she wandered off it, or you missed her." He jerked a splayed thumb toward the lamp. "How come the light?" We explained that Mrs. Walters had left it there in case Mr. Blair needed anything in the night. It sounded unlikely enough in my own ears as I told it, but he gave no indication of whether he accepted it or not. After a minute, he grunted and got to his feet. "If anything's happened to her," he said, you folks'll have to answer for it." It's have to answer for it. "You folks'll have to answer for it." In 2 strides, he had picked up the lantern and was out the door. Anne produced a flashlight from the hall and slipped it into my hand. We followed him without exchanging a word. Her face was still white, and she was biting her lip. Outside, the night was raw and dark, and a breeze had sprung up heavy with the smell of the sea. Anne and I let Seth Marcy go ahead of us, and followed without exchanging a word. There was nothing I cared to say that I wanted him to overhear. So we went down the road in a triangle, Seth in front with his lantern, and the two of us a few feet apart, with the flashlight trailing him. After some yards I went over to the side of the road, and I confess that I was extremely frightened. If Mrs. Walter's story was a true one, I knew what we should find there, but if it wasn't, well, that didn't bear thinking about. The story she had told had to be true. The prints were there, all right, and my heart gave a powerful thump of relief when I saw them. It was all right, then, and Mrs. Walters had not been lying. Though their edges had been softened by the tail end of the rain, which had fallen after they were made, the footsteps were distinct enough, punched heavily into the mud. "Look!" I called, and Seth Marcy stopped and came back to me with his lantern. "There are yours," I pointed out, "fresh and sharp. These others are blurred a bit, but you can still see them all right." He stared down at them, his face heavy and uncompromising, but there was no misreading that track in the mud. 2 sets of women's footmarks with water shining in them blackly where the heels had sunk deep, headed in the direction we had been going. And a single set coming back toward the house. "You see," I said, "here's the 2 of them going toward your house, Mr. Marcy, and this other single set is Mrs. Walters coming back." He nodded heavily. "Yeah." I was rather ashamed of myself over the triumph that I was feeling. After all, these prints told us nothing about where Mrs. Marcy was now, and it was selfish to be as relieved as I was. But we in the Talcott House were at least substantiated in our story. There had been no criminal negligence on our part. Seth Marcy stood staring at the footprints for a full minute, and then grunted and turned on down the road, holding his lantern low and walking carefully to one side of the impressions. Every few steps he paused and re-examined the tracks. Thus we proceeded down the road, anxiously and wordlessly, for perhaps a quarter of a mile. Seth stopped then, so long that Anne and I had time to catch up with him. When we arrived, we saw what it was that had halted him. There were a cluster of prints in the mud beside us, a number made by each woman. I could easily distinguish between Mrs. Walters' thinner, higher heels and the wide, run-over ones of Mrs. Marcy, although without that difference it might not have been too easy. The shoes were within a half size of each other. From one cluster, a line ran back toward the house we had left. "This must be where they separated," I said. "There's Mrs. Walters going back to the house." The farmer grunted.
Looks like it. Here's a Laura going on."
He picked up the lantern and began to walk forward more slowly. The 2 of us stayed right behind him now. "The mud must have been awful," Anne remarked. "Look how deep she sunk in." It was true that the prints were deep, but I remember the greasy gruel of mud on the road that afternoon and was not surprised. We kept on. Mrs. Marcy's steps had evidently been steady enough at first. They were spaced evenly and in a straight line. But after a couple of 100 yards they began to waver and straggle uncertainly from side to side of the path. The picture was all too easy to reconstruct. These footprints had been made by a woman who was staggering. For a few yards they would run straight again, and then angle off in confused sorties, sometimes towards the center of the road, and again toward the field grass along its edge. In the glow of the lantern, Seth Marcy's face was set, and the block of his jaw muscles stood out under the skin of his cheeks. He followed each of those pitiful divergencies in his wife's track patiently and without a word, but little by little his stride began to lengthen. Abruptly he came to a second halt, and when we reached him the reason was plain. In the mud was a rounded hollow, deeper at the end toward our line of direction, and beyond it the smudged outline of a hand which had slid through the mud. Either Mrs. Marcy had slipped, or she had half fallen from weakness, catching herself on one knee and one outflung hand. None of us was an expert trail reader, but the meaning of those marks in the mud was primer plain. I thought of the two women, their backs toward each other, going their separate ways, and Mrs. Marcy faint and dizzy with weakness. Why hadn't she called out? Maybe Mrs. Walters had gone too far to hear her. It was a picture that I didn't want to reconstruct in my mind. We pressed on more rapidly. There were other places where she had slipped and fallen. At one of them we could make out the mark of the curved umbrella handle, and I told Seth Marcy what it was. He did not seem to hear me. It was just after that when the anxiety in my mind turned to a sick anticipation of tragedy. The lights of the Marcy house were already in sight, ahead and well to our right. The road into it cannot have been more than a few rods beyond where we stopped, which was at the entrance to a rough sort of track which cut sharply off across the fields. It was nothing more than a haying road for farm wagons and machinery, but it was, even in the glow of one lantern, a perceptible turn-off, and it led to the right, just as the true entrance to the Marcy place did further on. And the prints of Mrs. Marcy's shoes turned down that miserable byway. When he saw that they did indeed leave the road, Seth Marcy gave a groan like a man in unbearable pain, and began to run heavily down the false track into which, by some horrible error, his wife had turned. Anne and I pounded along after him, and, as we ran, some change in the sky, or perhaps the sudden absence of tree masses against the night dark, told us what must be in his mind. For this rough trace of a road ran straight toward the river. We found the umbrella, its ribs broken and its handle coated with mud, caught against a scrub alder at the point where the field road turned again to the left, and ran along between the edge of the field and the river. But it was a turn that Mrs. Marcy had never made. We stood for a long time beside the last print of her shoes, staring down at the crumbled lip of sod, and below it, perhaps 10 feet, the strong black swirl of the Kennebec, where it cut in against the shore. Seth Marcy stood there, beside us like a man in a dream, looking down at the edge of the running water with dry, hot eyes. After a minute his lips moved. "God damn her," he said. "May her soul burn in hell for this." Neither Anne nor I thought for an instant that he meant his wife. Chapter 15. From that moment on, the night became a confusion and a madness of futile activities. I remember scrambling down that bank for one last, hopeless, stupid inspection of its slope, with Anne saying over and over, "Dick, look out! Come back!" and Seth Marcy running heavily up and down the edge of the bluff like a dog that has lost the scent of his quarry. There was no beach at the foot of that bluff, nothing but the deep swirl of the water against the same ledge of rock that lower down provided Julian's house with so firm a bulwark against the winter ice and spring floods. There wasn't even a tree against which she could have caught. For a minute I debated shedding my clothes and swimming down the bank along with the currents of the ebbing tide, and the river boiling along together. But the enterprise, though it did look possible, was clearly both dangerous and foolish. Nothing would be gained by it. When I scrambled up the bank, Seth Marcy was already plunging across the field toward his house. He's going to telephone, Anne said, "and then go into town for boats." "They won't find her," I said, "but I suppose I ought to go with him." No, she replied. He said for us to keep out of it, that we'd done enough harm already. Oh, Dick! Her voice broke, when I found her in the dark and put my arm around her shoulders, I felt that she was shaking. It's so horrible, she said in a small, broken voice. She was sweet, Dick, and she never had any fun, and now she's gone. Easy, all, I told her. Don't go. Don't let go. Come on now, we've got to get back to the house. All the way home, her hand was cold and tight inside mine, and once I thought how glad I was to be there with her. But most of the time my imagination was racing ahead, trying to foresee what this pitiful business was going to lead to in the next few days, and what I could do to protect Anne and Julian. And the more I considered it, the more it seemed to me that we were in for a very unpleasant time indeed. Mrs. Walters was in the kitchen when we got back, tired, muddy, cold, at least on my part, half stupefied with loss of sleep. I told her the story dully, not even bothering to watch her while I spoke. She said little, exclaimed with horror when I came to the part about the river bank, and finally declared in a low voice, "It's my fault, Professor Sayles. I accept the entire responsibility for what seems to have happened. I never would have let her start home unless I'd felt certain she was all right." "I believe you," I said, "but I only hope to God the rest of them do, particularly Seth Marcy." She made no reply to that, but poured out 2 cups of coffee, and Anne and I sat down to drink it. I discovered that my teeth were chattering, and when I picked up the cup, my hand trembled so that I hoped Anne wouldn't notice it. She kept looking at me most of the time, and the sorrow and regret in her eyes made a lump come into my throat. "Elora was a darling," she said once. I nodded. There wasn't anything I could think of that would help. When we finished the coffee, Anne and I went into the living room. Mrs. Walters said that she would make more of the stuff and that we could do what we wanted. "They'll be coming here later, of course," she added. "There's not much use in going back to bed." The living room was cold, and when we lighted the lamp, the shadows came back into the corners again. Through the south windows we could see that the black sweep of the river was sprinkled with distant lights, low against the water. I knew they were lanterns and flashlights in the bows of boats. They moved back and forth across the water, crawling from shore to shore with a grim persistence. Anne saw them too. "They're looking now. I suppose there isn't a chance." "I shouldn't think so." "She'd never be able to swim, of course. I hope it was quick for her." "You mustn't think about it." She lifted a white face to me. "I still can't quite believe it, Dick. How could she have taken that wrong turn? This is almost like her own backyard, this land around here." I had been thinking about that, and, even though it didn't wholly satisfy me, I said, "She must have had a bad concussion. They don't always show up right away." "Oh, yes, I suppose you're right." "Now listen," I told her. "We've got to stop thinking about what's already happened and get ready for what's coming." "Coming?" "Yes. There'll be people here after a while, and they're going to ask us a lot of questions, even an accidental death." That word was heavy in the air between us. She nodded, and the firelight was red gold in her hair. "I hadn't thought of that." "Furthermore, they'll all blame us for what's happened. Seth Marcy isn't going to be easy to deal with, though I guess most of what he feels will be directed against Mrs. Walters." She looked at me, and her lips were thin and pale across her face. "It was her fault, Dick. If only we'd stopped at Marcy's on the way to town." The same regret had been tormenting me. Being wise after the event is one of the things I do best, and it occurred to me that if we, or even one of us, had gone over to the Marcy house after supper to ask about Elora, it would have looked better. As it was, it seemed clear that we had acted in a way that would look stupid and callous to any outsider. But there was nothing for it but to face the music, try to behave as decently and calmly as we could, and make any recompense we could find to Seth Marcy. Sure, it was her fault, partly, I agreed, but I'm to blame somewhat, too. We should have done it differently. I decided to talk it over with her. I've been wondering if we ought to get a lawyer, I began, but the objection to that is people will think we are protecting ourselves because we feel guilty. She shivered. The people here. Her voice was low. They're going to hate us anyway. I began to pace back and forth across the room, and, even in the absorption of what I was thinking, I noticed how my shadow swelled and shrank against the far wall of the room. The only thing is to tell the truth and take the consequences. The prospect was a bitter one. We'll have to hope they believe us. Anne looked puzzled, and it seemed to me that her face was paler than before. What else can they think? Her voice was low, and there was a tremble in it. Nothing, of course, I said, damning myself for a fool. We may have been stupid, but that's the worst anybody could say. What's the worst anybody could say? Mrs. Walters had come into the room with the noiseless step that was one of the things about her I was beginning to hate. Anne and I were just talking about how all this was going to sound in Barsham Harbor, I said. We both think they'll hate us. She sat down on the sofa and looked at the pair of us in turn. And what if they do? Anne stared back at her. I should think you'd be a little worried about it. I should think you'd be a little worried about it, she said, and her voice was bitter now instead of afraid. If you'd been listening to Seth Marcy and what he was saying, you wouldn't be so calm about it. He hates us, all of us, and you most especially. Her tone was clear and hard. It rang in the room. Mrs. Walters folded her hands. Don't shout at me, she said. I want Julian to get all the rest he can. She studied the tips of her fingers and then flexed them slowly in a movement so feline and relaxed that it made me want to look away. Seth Marcy is a lout. I know his kind. You leave Seth Marcy to me. If he tries to make any trouble, I'll take care of it. And him. Those words of hers may read like sheer bombast, but they did not sound so in that shadowy room. I was shocked by the cold determination in her voice, the flat indifference to a tragedy which had happened only hours before. You know, I said as quietly as I could, there's not a chance that Mrs. Marcy is still alive? She nodded without speaking. Well, we're all responsible for that simple, elemental, and horrible fact, Mrs. Walters. You more than the rest of us. She gave me back as good as I gave her in the manner of glances. Her eyes were perfectly steady and as deep as the shadows behind her. Professor Sales, I should expect more self-control and judgment in a man who's no longer a boy. Anne moved then as though she'd been flicked with a whip, but Mrs. Walters never so much as glanced at her, and for my part I hope I did not give any sign of what I was feeling. The voice when she went on was controlled, but there was something cold and light in it that was close to contempt. I'm as sorry as you both are for this accident, but Mrs. Marcy died quickly and with no pain. There was nothing here in this life for her anyway. I'm sure she is happier at this moment than she has ever been before. Something in my look must have warned her, for she added with what I still believe to have been sincere conviction. Death isn't the terrible thing most people make it out to be. Of course not, I said, and the pulse in my throat was so strong it partly choked me. It's hardly more important than a dropped stitch when you're knitting, is it? At that she got up and went to the window. When she finally answered, with her back toward us, her voice was smooth and low, but I was sure that there was some reason why she wanted to keep us from watching her face while she spoke.
I forgot, she remarked, that neither of you has faith or understanding. To you, what has happened to Mrs. Marcy must seem tragic and irrevocable. I am sorry for that.
For a while after that there was silence in the room, and, when she spoke again, her voice was wholly different, strained, taut, as if some control over herself were slipping.
"We are all tired and frightened," she said. "It was my fault. I should not have let her go the rest of the way home alone. But when she was with me, she seemed so perfectly natural."
She waited for one of us to make some comment, but Anne shook her head at me, and we kept silent.
"You must have seen how it was by our footsteps. You must have seen how it was by our footprints. She was walking along like a person who was absolutely uninjured."
The inflection in her voice at the end of that sentence was too faint to be definitely questioning, but I knew that she expected one of us to reply. And with that knowledge I suddenly became curious as to why exactly she wanted us to speak. Did she expect some approbation for her caution in going part way home with Mrs. Marcy? Or, and I could not see where this thought led, did she want us to admit that we had seen the footprints? Anne had brightened at her words.
"Yes," she said eagerly, "that's right. There are the footprints. Dick, that ought to help with them, don't you think? And with Seth Marcy, too."
"They'll help," I said, and then added reluctantly, "but they won't be enough to absolve us." Mrs. Walters' tone was edged with scorn.
"You talk as if we were going to be tried for something."
I shrugged. "Well, I don't know much about small towns, but I suspect we shall be tried and found guilty on every street corner."
"Nonsense! Guilty of what?"
"Criminal negligence." She confronted me angrily.
"Are we back on that same old track?"
"All right, Mrs. Walters," I said. "If you're tired of old subjects, here's a new one. There'll be a coroner's inquest when they find the body. We'll all be questioned then, and it's going to be hard to answer some of those questions. Notably, why you didn't go all the way home with Mrs. Marcy, and why one of us at least didn't bother to go over to find out how she was and whether she was all right."
"Inquest?"
Her tone was short, as though the thought had jolted her. "But yes," I answered. So Anne's thought about the footprints is a good one. It may help to clear your skirts. Contempt and impatience were stamped on her face.
"If both of you would stop talking as if we were guilty of something, it would be at least sensible. I admit I hadn't thought about the inquest, but after all, it's not going to do us any harm to be able to tell our story in public."
Anne and I let it go at that. I did not trust myself to say anything more to what Mrs. Walters... My lips. I did not trust myself to say anything more to Mrs. Walters, and she believed as if the two of us were no longer in the room. She had turned back to her window. I wondered if the boat lights were still crawling back and forth across the invisible water. It was impossible to tell from her stance what she was seeing, if anything. Her heavy body was simply at rest beside the window, bulking there without tension or an expressive line in it. After what seemed like, and may even have been, 10 minutes, she turned away and passed us without a word. At the door to the room she paused and turned back toward us, the way actresses of the old school used to stop in their exits and turn back on the audience for one last line.
"I'm going up again for a while," she said. "Call me if you need me. There's coffee on the stove if you want it, or if anybody comes. I won't take my clothes off, so I can come right down."
Neither of us answered, but I nodded.
"And my advice to you both is not to sit round talking each other into a state of nerves. You both need sleep. They'll make enough noise when they come."
Then she was gone. A stair tread creaked once when she put her weight on it, and after that everything was silent. We sat together on the sofa. This time I did put my arm around Anne, and from the way her head went down against my shoulder, I knew she wanted it that way. After a short time, she said, "Do you mind sitting here a while? I'm tired, but I can't bear going into my room alone, and I know I couldn't sleep." She was soft against me, and the smell of her hair reminded me of the grass and the morning sun by the beach. "I'll stick around as long as you want me to," I said. "Thank you, Dick. It's been a long time since I've done this, hasn't it?" "Yes." "I'm glad you're back," she said, and then looked up at me. There were circles under her eyes, I saw, with a quick contraction of the heart, but she was laughing. "And I'm glad to be back." "Don't do things like that to an old man," I said. She stopped laughing and looked at me intently. "I suppose you are old, aren't you? 12 years older than I am. Well..." She dropped her head against my shoulder. She dropped her head against my shoulder again and sighed. We sat there together for a long time. After a while I got out my pipe and smoked it once, and then a second time. Anne used up several cigarettes, but most of the time she stayed with her head down, leaning against me while I thought about her, and about the mess we were in, and how much I wished things were different. I tried hard to be happy about one thing, which was that at least this business had brought Anne and me back together in a... Okay, let's try that again. I tried hard to be happy about one thing, which was that at least this business had brought Anne and me back together again in a single day. It might have taken weeks or months to recover our old intimacy without the pressure of disaster to bring us together. But the thought wouldn't work. It ought to have been a good thing to feel glad over, but it simply wasn't. That in itself interested me as a psychologist. I knew that I was fond of Anne, just as I had been when Helen was alive, and that the events of this long, incredible day had wiped out the constraint that would normally lie between two people who have been separated for years. I even had enough sense to know there was a good chance that I would ultimately find myself in love with her as well. The very feeling of her weight against me, the sensation of her warmth, the scent of her hair, these things were keenly present in my thoughts. But not as I wished they were, clear down into the center of myself. There was something underneath my awareness of Anne, something cold and inhibiting. They say that in Alaska the summer warms the surface of the land so that you can grow crops on it, but that underneath the ground is frozen even in August. That is something the way it was with me that evening in the living room of the house on Setauket Point. I think, if I had kissed her then and told her that I loved her, abrupt as it would have seemed under ordinary circumstances, she would have understood and responded to it. But I didn't, because I couldn't. There was something in the way, the only thing, I suspect, that can come between a man and a woman when they love each other, and it was to lie between us not only then, but later. The sundering thing was fear. You can love when you are cold, hungry, sad, swiftly frightened, even when you are otherwise bored, as honeymoons go to show, but not when you are afraid. And I was afraid. It was quiet in that room, unmovingly, oppressively, chillingly silent there and through the whole house. The faint hiss of the lamp wick and the sounds of our breathing were the only ones in my ears. I knew that, because I was listening, nominally for the return of Seth Marcy and perhaps others with him. They would come here whether they found her or not. I was certain of that. But the noise of footsteps was not the only one in my imagination. There was that other sound, the thing we had heard as we ran across the meadow in the rain. It must have happened the very instant that Mrs. Marcy had fallen on the stairs. I wondered if it had really been the reason why she had slipped. There might be nothing more in the two things than coincidence, but I am not a strong believer in that kind of coincidence. No, there was some kind of connection, and I was far from feeling certain that it was the obvious one. If people fell downstairs often when there was a clap of thunder, but they didn't. And that hadn't been a clap of thunder. My thoughts revolved around this point over and over again in futility. I would shut my eyes and try to think just what that sound might have been, and instead, there against the lids, I would see Julian and Mrs. Walters at the foot of the stairs, looking down at Mrs. Marcy. She had seemed small, lying there, like a bird that had run into a window pane and stunned itself or broken its neck. Probably Mrs. Walters was right, and she hadn't had much of a life. Whatever it had been, it was over now. Perhaps that was, as Mrs. Walters claimed, a merciful thing. I jerked myself back from this kind of thinking with horror. Never before in my life had I entertained such a stupid and morbid notion as that death could be preferable to life, any kind of life, no matter how dismal. Although, of course, if Julian could actually prove that there was another life afterward, and that concept brought me up short. There must be something in the air of this house or in its silence to make me think in this maudlin fashion. Then I remembered how tired I was. That would account for everything. Fatigue poisons in the blood. Chapter 16. We had a long wait that night, Anne and I, before anyone came to the house. Once I went to the back door and out along the road a short distance. But there were no headlights on it coming our way, though I could see that the Marcy house was still lighted. And straining my eyes in the blackness, I thought that I could make out a cluster of yellow light flecks between me and it, far off to the right. That would be another party gone down to read the story in those footprints and look, as I had done earlier, at the cut bank and the black, silent sweep of the water against the shore. Remembering how it pressed in against the rock and ricocheted back and out again from the land, I felt a kind of horror. I am a good enough swimmer, but even fresh and uninjured, I should not have cared to go into the river where those footprints ended. I went back to Anne without a word and held her close again. It must have been long past 2 in the morning when a car finally did drive up to the house. The two of us had heard it coming. In spite of fatigue, our ears were preternaturally sharpened, and we were standing on the back steps when it swept around the end of the barn and the headlights flooded blindingly over us. I felt like an insect pinned to a board. Whoever was driving brought the car to a sudden halt and switched the lights down to dim. There was the slam of a door, and then, as the driver came between us and the headlamps, I saw to my surprise that it was a woman. All that I could tell about her at first was that she had thin legs and was wearing heavy, sensible Oxfords. It was not until she was almost up to the steps where we were standing that I could get any idea of her beyond that. She was, I saw then, a woman of somewhere between 40 and 50, spare, erect, with the kind of long face and heavy nose that are supposed to be typical of the New England spinster. Okay. She had a bandana of some sort tied over her hair and was wearing a tailored suit which was something short of fashionable. Her walk suggested that she used her legs for getting across country rather than fascination. And yet there was nothing daunting or formidable about her. I liked the way she came over to us and did not begin speaking till she was on the steps. "Hello," she said then, and her voice was open and quiet, grave but not somber. "Good evening," I said. "I'm Ellen Hoskins. Is my brother here yet?" Why, no, I'm afraid I don't know any Mr. Hoskins. Anne, do you? No, said Anne, her voice sounding so cordial that I knew she liked this woman just as I had. But that needn't matter. I'm sure I've seen you in town. Will you come in? The woman said, "Thank you," and came into the kitchen. My brother Dan, she told us, is the sheriff. Anne's "Oh" was less cordial. Miss Hoskins smiled. "But he's quite human. He asked me to bring the car out here and wait for him. He ought to be along any minute." She looked at us pityingly. "You must have had a horrible evening of it." "Yes," I said, and then, moistening my lips, "Have they found her?" She nodded. "Dead?" Anne's voice was steady but faint. "Yes, I'm sorry." The news was no more than what we had both known we should have to hear sooner or later. I'm going to try that sentence again. I know how that runs, but my brain wasn't latching on properly. The news was no more than what we had both known we should have to hear sooner or later, but for all that it settled into my mind, cold and hard. A sudden wave of sadness went over me. Sadness and fear, as I had to admit to myself. I wondered what was going to happen now. Ellen Hoskins was looking round the kitchen. Her eye traveled to the lamp still burning on the table, but it did not pause there. She surveyed the whole room quietly, as though it interested her. Its placid, shabby orderliness seemed to please her in some way, and she nodded to herself. Anne and I looked at her with curiosity. It was hard to tell what she was, though if her brother were sheriff, presumably she belonged to Barsham Harbor. Still, I decided, not entirely. Her tweed suit, though old and unashamedly patched on one elbow, was well tailored, and I thought the brown sweater under it had probably come from England. There was something crisp and assured in her manner that was puzzling at first, until it occurred to me that it was businesslike.
Crazy thought that a woman could be businesslike.
I guess. Her hands, too, were not those of a housewife, country or town. Their fingernails were short and uncolored, but they were polished. And her shoes, though they were dark with age and wear and smeared here and there with mud, were definitely handmade. She drew a deep breath. "It's good to get inside," she observed. "Summer's about over and the nights are cold." Anne's response was quick. "Would you like a cup of hot coffee?" "No, thank you, but Dan'll be glad of one when he arrives. It's been cold out on the water, I expect." "Come on into the living room," I said. "The places to sit in there are somewhat softer." She grinned at that. "I can see you're not from this part of the world," she said, and then added, "Either of you." "No," I admitted, and we went into the front of the house. Through the window at the end of the room, I noticed that the night was now wholly black and empty. The lights had gone from the water. Anne drew a deep breath and said, as if the words hurt her throat, They found her quickly, didn't they? We thought it might take a long time." Ellen Hoskins settled herself in the chair where Mrs. Walters had sat earlier that night and began to fish in a side pocket of her jacket. "There's an eddy below Barsham," she said matter-of-factly. "One of the men, Harry Miller his name is, happened to think that with the tide ebbing, if there was a body in the river, it ought to appear there. So he waited a while and finally found her." "Oh." Anne's face was white, and she sat down quickly on the sofa again. The sheriff's sister watched her a moment and then produced a package of 10-cent cigarettes, extracted one, and lighted it. "It's a horrible thing," she said, and in spite of her casualness and unconcern, her tone showed that she meant the adjective. "But you mustn't But you mustn't think too much about it, Miss—" "Connor," I said, and added, "My name's Sales. Richard Sales." She nodded as if our names interested her in some way. "Thank you. My point is that you ought to take this as quietly as you can, and don't worry about Dan's coming here to talk to you. It's his job, of course, even in cases of accidental deaths." "We understand that," I said with enough emphasis on the final word to make her smile. "But not me? Well, Dan's a good sheriff, but the sight of a pencil and a piece of paper is more'n he can stand. He foists off the notes on me. When I'm home, that is.
That must be interesting.
Anne was smiling again. Sometimes. Ellen Hoskins was noncommittal, but a lot of it's just hard work. Or tragic. We'd all give a lot if this hadn't happened, I said into the pause that followed. Seth Marcy is taking it hard, she observed with what was too ladylike to be a sniff, in spite of the fact that so far I know he never did anything to make Alora's life pleasant or even tolerable. Her manner changed. But I should be careful if I were you, all of you. The people here are different from the ones you're probably accustomed to. They'll blame you for what's happened. It wasn't our fault.
It wasn't our fault. No, Miss Connor, but it is going to look that way to most of them. And then...
She broke off abruptly and put her head on one side.
I wonder what's keeping Dan.
Was he coming straight here?
No, he was going to see Seth Marcy home and come on to talk to all of you.
It doesn't matter. We're not sleepy, I said.
Maybe not, but you ought to be. You both look tired. And you, Professor Sales, only arrived today. The train always tires me, and probably it does you.
So you know my title and when I arrived? I was puzzled.
Oh, yes. In Barsham Harbor we know everything half an hour after it's happened. Your arrival was all over town by the middle of the morning, and I deduced the professor part from the fact that you came from New York and have a more or less unusual name. Knowing that you are visiting Julian Blair, I conclude that you must be the Richard Sales who wrote The Elements of Experimental Psychology. I'm a secretary at Cambridge in the winter, and in the Department of Psychology.
She gave a sort of dry smile.
You see how easy it was.
I see why your brother is sheriff, Miss Hoskins.
She laughed at that. Oh, I don't do any of the sheriffing. I take Dan's notes for him and I type them, but he does all the hard work.
This was a clever woman. For all the pleasant homeliness of that long face of hers and the angular awkwardness of the way she sat in her chair, I was conscious of her shrewdness and mentally decided that it would be well to be cautious about what we said to her. She took another pull on her cigarette and remarked,
I hope you're not offended by my knowing who you are.
Not at all, I said, flattered. But there does seem to have been a good deal of talk about Julian and the rest of us in the village.
Inevitably. They haven't much else to do, so they talk about anybody and everybody. And when there's nothing else to say, they gossip. They've been gossiping about this house and the people in it ever since Professor Blair came. Furiously. And without anything really to go on. Which means that they've had to make up stories. For instance, one about a death ray that a lot of them are convinced Mr. Blair is inventing.
She tapped the ash off her cigarette with an abrupt gesture.
Dan's going to have some trouble, I'm afraid.
I had a suspicion what that last remark meant. The good folk of Barsham Harbor, with this tragedy for a pretext, would expect the sheriff to take some kind of action. Action against Julian, or Mrs. Walters, or all of us. Seth Marcy, of course, and that cousin of his who'd driven me out from the station. The thought of those two men made me uncomfortable. They wouldn't be easy to reason with. Ellen Hoskins seemed unperturbed by the silence that followed, but after a time she looked from one of us to the other.
By the way, she said, it's not my business, but where are the rest of you?
Upstairs. Julian, Mr. Blair, isn't strong, and after Mrs. Marcy's fall he took a sleeping tablet. Some unpremeditated impulse made me add, at least so Mrs. Walters told us. He doesn't even know what's happened yet. It seemed to me that she sat up a trifle in her chair.
So, the fall was a great shock to him then?
Yes, we all thought she was badly hurt for a minute. But even while I was making that reply, it struck me as curious that Julian should have been so shaken by the accident. He must have changed a great deal, I reflected. In the old days he would never have been so disturbed by an event that affected him only at second hand. Impersonally kind and troubled he might have been, perhaps, but not reduced to the white and trembling figure I had taken in charge. All at once there was a thought in my mind which I had not summoned. That accident to Mrs. Marcy must have meant something to him, something important. But how could Elora Marcy have been anything important to Julian in any way at all? The idea was ridiculous. From what I hear, Ellen Hoskins was saying, your Mrs. Walters is quite an unusual person. That depends on what you mean, I answered cautiously. She had the grace to smile. You don't need to worry. I'm not here in any official capacity. Maybe I just have the Barsham curiosity. Anne broke in on that. I can't understand why she hasn't come down. She's a very light sleeper. She hears the smallest noise. She must be worn out, Ellen Hoskins commented. Yes, I agreed, but the explanation was unsatisfactory to some watchful segment of my mind. I still believe that Mrs. Walters should have come downstairs when Ellen Hoskins arrived. I think she overplayed her hand just that one time. She overplayed it because she should have realized that neither Anne nor I would be quite willing to believe that she was really asleep. And yet, it is actually possible she really was asleep. That day must have put an intolerable strain on her. However it was, the three of us went on talking in consequences for what seemed like an eternity, trying not to let the tide of silence dammed up in that house flood over us. At least that was what Anne and I were talking for. Ellen Hoskins appeared to have no purpose but the social one. Once I thought to myself that this conversational night piece was fantastic beyond any credence. There we were, chit-chatting away as if it weren't 3 a.m. and as if this Ellen Hoskins' brother hadn't just been fishing a woman's body out of the river. A woman who had been alive, walking, talking, singing to herself in this very house a few hours before. And my friend, Julian Blair, lying asleep and drugged upstairs. This was going to be nasty for him in the next few days. And Anne, the pieces of it began to fall apart in my mind with fatigue. I could barely keep myself awake enough to make a decently conscious remark now and again. To this day, I cannot remember what trivia we discussed in that half hour before the sheriff came. Oh, let's see, how long is this next chapter? Actually, you know what? How long is the rest of the book? Give me a sec here. I'm mathing out what I need to do. How many more? Let's see, that puts it at 40-odd pages. Yeah, that probably divvies it up handily. I am going to call it good at that for today. I think... Actually, how long is that chapter? I might do one more chapter. Why not? I got a little time. Yeah, it's 10 pages. No, I'm going to call it for today. Sorry. I do have some things I have to do. Where did I put my alternate bookmark here? My beta bookmark. Bookmark the second. Anyway, so things are moving along. Rest in peace, Miss Marcy. What is making that sound, one wonders? I happen to know what it is, but I can't tell any of you about it. And I won't. Until the time is right. Hopefully next week we will be able to continue on. I don't know what my schedule for next week looks like. Hopefully it will be the normal Monday, Wednesday, Friday, but it might not. I will not know until pretty late. For updates on that, you can join the Discord, and I'll post it there when I know. Let's see. Friday looks like it's still a lock. We should be able to do more of The Nightland by William Hope Hodgson, and we will. After that, we'll figure out what's going on for next week, and we'll go from there.
Thanks to everyone who tuned in. Hopefully people are enjoying the story, even through my stuffy head and sleepy countenance. Yeah, it's a pretty good one. It winds up being actually a pretty good murder mystery as well. There's some pretty clever planning that goes on. So good, you could probably make it into a movie or something. Maybe, as a thought. Yeah, anything else salient I need to yammer or yap about? No, not really. There's something I will yap about next time, I suppose, since I've opened the door for it. But we'll see when that actually happens. So yeah, currently my schedule is going to get crazy in the next week or two. I don't know when exactly. It might be another week. And at that point, all bets are off for at least a month, probably several. So I'm going to have to play it by ear a bit. I'm hoping to get done all of the books that I've got teed up right now. I will prioritize, because my available days for streaming are going to be pretty limited, is how it's looking. And this is unfortunately not due to holiday goodness. I mean, it is, but it's not like family vacation stuff. It's work things that I will not be talking about, unless I get truly disenfranchised with the whole process and don't care about being fired. Or whatever, or leaving, or will have left, or whatever. Have I signed an NDA? Probably. I should double check that. I have, I do know that. Anyway, after that, so for the time of unsettlement, I will be prioritizing getting through to, Endymion by Dan Simmons. That is, the highest priority. After that, Cytine by C.J. Cherry, and ideally the novelization for Mobile Suit Zeta Gundam, which I still haven't gotten around to reading all of yet. I've only read like the first 2 parts, 2/5 of it. I haven't gotten around to the rest. So I've got to get off my duff and do that. I did just get done reading a book on my own time called Red Noise by John P. Murphy. It is excellent. It is going to be fast-tracked. I am definitely going to be reading it on here. It is too good and entertaining not to. It is Yojimbo in space. But it is also more than that. It is something other than that. But it wears its influences on its sleeve. He makes no bones about it. He doesn't say the movie by name, but he says everything else about it that's relevant. It's pretty clear, and it's extremely well rendered. Very, very funny. Very punchy. Very good stuff. Highly recommend. Because I don't recognize the publisher. The publisher is... where are you? Where is the publisher? I didn't recognize their logo. Angry Robot, who apparently they're, I guess, a sci-fi primarily, because most of the stuff I'm seeing by them is science fiction and some fantasy. A relatively new publishing house, I believe. They've got, like all good books have, they've got a preview for another book by the publisher entitled The Outside by Ada Hoffman. And just that little segment there had me going pretty good, so I'm going to be hunting that down while I'm at it. While I look for that book series that... I have a backlog of books that I want to read for my personal gratification that's, I don't know, like 10, 15 books or more books long. So I have to be pretty cautious about adding to the pile. But I probably will anyway, because I have an addiction, and it's a satisfying one for me. I enjoy it. I enjoy reading books, what can I say? I wouldn't be doing this if I didn't. It is definitely different reading them aloud, and I knew it would be. Some, I think, come to me easier than others. I
I'm surprised at how well the Nightland is going, even though it's like the prose he uses makes me cry. The prose he uses makes me hyperventilate, actually. I like get anxiety. I'm like, oh my god, how do I keep reading this? Am I going to lose my mind? Am I still me? Who is this? I don't get it's not that bad. It's as you shall think. It gives me some trouble, as you shall think. Anyway, with that, I'm going to call it good. Short one today, I know. My apologies. But that's the way the cookie crumbles sometimes. Anyway, hopefully people are staying safe, staying sane, and being as toasty and or cool as their geolocation permit. And I will see you on Friday for more of the Nightland. Alrighty. Until then, toodaloo.